Hi, class, and welcome to Chapter 1 Intro to Social Psych. Today, we're going to be covering the basics of what social psychology is and where it came from. Now, when we think about social psychology, I'm a little biased as a social psychologist, but I think of social psychology as more or less what we do and how we do it, which I know sounds pretty vague if you think about what psych is. But the definition of social psychology and what we'll use throughout the semester as our definition is that it is a scientific study of how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced. So all of that is very psyche, but it's influenced by others, whether those people are real, whether those people are imagined, or whether those people are just even implied. Simply imagining that, somebody could be watching you through a webcam is maybe enough to make you act differently. What's interesting about this is it feels a little like common sense, right? Well, this is just how people influence other people. Everybody knows that. My younger brother was one to always say, sounds like you're studying things that just everybody knows. Well, I always like to start out with a little kind of description of why I don't think that's right. And when it comes to that, it's the fact that we're talking about an actual science, right? And that science outdoes a story or what a person's anecdote is. While it may be the case that you had an experience or you know someone who had an experience that goes different to the majority of people, right? That happens, right? It might be the case where your uncle's, brothers, sisters, cousins, dogs, roommate acted a certain way that goes against something I'm going to say. The fact of the matter is everybody doesn't experience things the same way. Good example of this from my own life, right? We know that wearing seatbelts, that's common sense. That's something that keeps you safe. And what happened to my mother actually was that she was in a nasty car wreck, looked a lot like this. And the only reason she survived that car wreck was because she got thrown out of the car because she wasn't wearing her seatbelt. So certainly, right, it's a thing where there very well might be differences between your life and what I'm talking about. However, on the whole, we are talking about kind of in general. And so with that, I always like to just start with something even simple too, to give you an idea of if this is common sense. How's this guy feel? Mad or happy? He could be excited about something. So in class, I do a common sense quiz, which I'll go ahead and work through now with you. Do you think, true or false, smiling makes you happier? People are generally skilled at knowing whether someone is lying. People have other people around them that actually makes them better on things that are easy. To change the way that people act, you need to change their attitudes. That people will cheer louder when they cheer as part of a group than compared to when they cheer alone. That in a romantic relationship, it's more of this idea that opposites attract than birds of a feather flock together. It's better to be different than it is to be similar. In an emergency situation, the more people there are, the more likely you are to be helped. 8, blowing off steam by engaging in aggressive activities makes you less aggressive. Most people will disobey a person of authority who asks them to hurt a stranger. And 10, physically attractive individuals are seen as less intelligent than unattractive individuals. How do you feel about those? Well, let's see how you did. You can count up your number of right and wrong ones here, and I'd be interested to know if you got more wrong than you think. Something to note is that we will cover each of these points at some point throughout this semester. So if you are interested in any of these topics, know that they will be coming up. But that kind of gives us this idea that psychology isn't just common sense. It's how our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors are affected by other people. It's really the way I like to think about this. It's how a person is acting within a situation. It's not just common sense. It's not personality either. Right? Personality psychology is how we're consistent over time, but this is how we deal with others. It's not cognitive psychology, which is focused on how we think about those things, how we understand the world. And, well, it's kind of like sociology or anthropology, but it's too specific. Sociology and anthropology look at a bigger picture. We're looking at people, right? Not groups of people or communities type thinking. So to continue on that point, I'd like to note that Kurt Lewin He's going to be who we consider the father of social psychology. Kurt Lewin was an individual who was over in Europe at the beginning of World War II. He was Jewish and he understood the nature of what was happening in his region at the time. So he moved to America and he wanted to begin to study what it is that causes people to do things. And he argued that we're always being influenced by a field of forces. The force of gravity, for instance, always helps keep us in our chairs or down off the right from floating away. But there's social forces. I could, if you were in the room, I might ask you to do something and you do that. Why? Because you feel forced almost to do that. And he used this really nice formula. B is the function of P and E, or behavior. A person's behavior is the function of the person, their personality, who they are, and the environment, the situational factor. For instance, you all hopefully have logged in to watch this video and are learning from it. However, some of you might be really interested in it. Some of you might not be. So what you do while watching this video is both a combination of who you are and the fact that this is supposed to be something you're watching. The idea that the situation is also an important component of this, not just personality. And this is something we're going to go throughout the semester. So next, I want to talk about a brief history of social psych, where this kind of comes from, as well as some of the recurring themes that we're going to see throughout this semester. So in terms of a brief history of this, theoretically, we could talk about psychology and how people are influenced by one another all the way back to ancient Greece, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato. But in terms of this being a science, well, it wasn't until 1889 that we're going to start really getting into this. And there's going to be two studies in here, one by a guy named Triplett. He conducted a study involving bicyclists, and he wanted to see whether cyclists rode faster if they were cycling alone or cycling in a group of people. And Triplett found that when cyclists are in a group, right, they do better. They perform better than when they are cycling individually. A couple years later, 15 years later, Ringelmann, another psychologist, runs a different experiment where he has people in a series of experiments pull on tug-of-war ropes, either individually or as a group. And he measured how much effort people put in. And what he found, I didn't put this up for you, is that when compared to working in a group, people individually give more effort. So in 15 years, we have two experiments. One that says people do better when they work in a group, and one that says people do better when they work alone. This is a problem, and this kind of goes into an interesting thing that we're talking about social psych, which is context, but we'll get to that later. So in terms of where social psych came from, there was a lot of major impact of world events, specifically World War II, right? Understanding, right, asking questions, how do we understand the world? Why are people persuaded to do these awful things? Treating one another horribly. How is it that stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination happen and spread? How is it that normal, everyday people would obey these terrible authority figures? And how is it that we would conform to group behaviors, doing what other people do? At this point, behaviorism is still the dominant way of looking at things, rewards versus punishments. But it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s in psychology that social got a little bit of a kick in the pants when we had some major ethical issues. Talking about Milgram's experiment, talking about the Zimbardo prison experiment. And these studies were run, as we'll talk about later in the semester, in order to show that these things can happen outside of the lab. They are real life type examples. This is not just some teacher telling a student what to do. right? The fact that these are all artificial ideas, or, these are all undergrads requiring you to do this. This is helping us to learn that, some of this stuff does matter, and that the real world does play a role. Context has an important role here. You also have an extreme pushback on the other side. This idea that Walter Mischel, you may have heard of this guy because of the marshmallow study he's known for. He argued that there's no such thing as personality, that it's just the situation that determines what we do. But that's pretty extreme, and we're not going to go quite that far here. So moving on, in the 70s and to the 90s, we started to realize that the mind is almost best thought of as like a computer. There's inputs and outputs, right? That we process information the same as other information, except for social information, right? We know that certain aspects of a situation influence how we process information. If we're afraid, we might look for different cues than if we're not afraid. And so instead of these real life experiments, we start to look at this idea of social cognition. Chapter 4 will cover this idea of how do people actually process that social information. But a lot of this research no longer looks at how we are acting in like groups, or how we are looking in kind of bigger pictures, real life style. So there's many now influences on this idea here of what is covering psychology. So you'll notice that modern social psychology takes the best components from a lot of other sides of psychology to help us understand why we do the things we do. But overall, you'll note that this idea really runs deeply, that this is all contextualized. The context, what you are doing, matters here. So now what I'd like to do is just briefly run through a couple concepts that you're going to see a lot of times throughout the book. So these are going to be some running themes, and it'd be helpful for you to kind of recognize what these themes are now, so when we see them again in context, they'll be much more useful. And the first one is this idea of naive realism, right? If you look at this picture down in the corner, you might see two faces, or you might see a vase. But either way, you personally are going to be of this belief that however you saw that, that's the way it really is. You perceive the world as if everybody sees the world in the way that we do, right? This idea that you might see this guy as either a rabbit or a duck, and you are going to think about your way as the right way of doing this. So note that the way that we are going to believe that we see the world right, but other people might not. Another concept is called the fundamental attribution error. So this is the idea that when another person cuts us off in traffic, say, we think that that is a disposition, that is who they are. They are a jerk and a bad person. But if I cut somebody off in traffic, I'm not going to think, oh, I'm a bad person. I'm going to think, oops, that was a situational factor. I wasn't paying attention. This example at the bottom here, I think, does a really good job, right? Imagine that you are late to turn in a paper or something. Is your professor going to think of you in terms of situational factors? Probably not. They're going to think that you are lazy or something of this sort. So that's something that, right, you're going to see come up here a couple times in this book. We're also going to talk about this concept of automaticity. Automaticity is the idea that as you get really used to doing the same things over and over, they become automatic. You may have automaticity when it comes to driving. If you've ever driven your car and driven through a couple stoplights and been listening to music, and then you go, how did I get here? I didn't crash my car. You were using automatic thinking to exist and to drive a car. And that is related to this idea of fluency, the idea that we are going to try to do things automatic, and we are going to do things that are more fluent or easier for us to perceive. So the easier we can make things for us, the more automatic our minds will treat them. And here's an example of this difference in actually changing fluency here, this is an incredible study where we put the smell of fish oil, a fishy smell, in the air, and it made people more suspicious, actually, when smelling a fishy smell, which relates to this idea also of construal level, how you perceive or understand the world, how you construe this. One way you can think about this is through like psychological distance, or in your mind, how far or close something is. A good example of this for me is, right, so if I am going on a trip in a month, what am I thinking about when I think about the trip? How am I construing that trip? I'm thinking, oh boy, I can't wait to go on my trip. I'm going to have a good time. We're going to have lots of fun. It's going to be cool. When it's the night before the trip, I'm going to be thinking differently. I'm going to be thinking, oh no, I need to pack for this trip. What if I forget I don't want to be late to the airport. I hope there's nice weather. And so this idea of how you perceive the world as either low in terms of distance, concrete distance, seeing things more specifically, like tomorrow, knowing that you're going on this trip tomorrow, versus seeing this as a high level or an abstract concept going on this trip in a month from now. So you can also imagine how a high level construal, an abstract construal can be thinking of like, imagine a building. What do you mean by that? Just something with 4 walls and a ceiling and some windows. Sure, that's very abstract. It's kind of broad. Compare that to something like, I ask you to imagine your childhood home, or, the home that you currently live in. Those are both thoughts about a building. You're construing thoughts about a building, but one has a lot more concrete detail, your childhood home, versus imagine a building. Is it 2-story? Is it 30 stories? It could be anything. From there, we also talk about this concept of schemas. So schemas or schematics or blueprints kind of goes back to the idea of automaticity, that we will pull up our automatic blueprints for a situation. When the flight attendant says, have a nice flight, you sometimes accidentally say, you too, right? This is because the knowledge in a situation might usually be just to say, you too to the person. Schemas are very important because they help us to understand how to act in the world. You have a schema for how to act around professors or how to act on a date versus how you might act around your friends. You also have schemas about different things or concepts about the world. You have a schema for what a college class should look like. If the entire class I gave you was, you have to send me videos of you interpretive dancing, that would not be a normal college class. That wouldn't fit in your class of your schema of college classes, I should say. So this is the idea of understanding kind of the framework by which you see the world. Finally, the last concept that we're going to talk about throughout this is the fact that your culture matters a lot. Now, I'm going to assume most people watching this video are from America, the Western kind of most typified culture. And this is the idea of a very independent culture. America is an independent, and Western Europe are independent cultures. They tend to be more focused and place a focus in the culture on individuals taking care of themselves, doing things for themselves. Compare this to other cultures, more Eastern cultures, so more Asian cultures and South American cultures tend to be more collectivistic or interdependent, interlocked together, where they identify with each other more and are thinking less in terms of how I get what I need and more in terms of how we all get what we need. Collective grouping. And you'd be surprised at how much this is going to come up in the ways that it affects the way that we construe and understand the world. But this is just a very short lecture I have done, hopefully to help you all understand the basics of social psych. If you do have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out, and I would be happy to chat with you. I hope you all are doing well, and if there is anything I can do, don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day, everyone.